Have you been thinking of creating a podcast and just weren't sure if you wanted a solo podcast or if you needed to interview guests? So if you're having trouble trying to figure out if it's okay to be a solo podcaster, then stay tuned. Solo podcasts are becoming increasingly popular as a lot of people just want to show up and share their story with their audience without having to worry about scheduling guests and co-hosts. So is this for you possibly? Let's talk about it. I do believe that a solo podcast opens up a lot of opportunity for creating content. And one of the misconceptions, however, is that a solo podcast lacks that enthusiasm or that collaboration feeling that you get when you have a room full of people or even just two people talking about something together. That conversation does bring a little bit of a dynamic that a solo podcast doesn't. However, you can make your solo podcast quite engaging. We're going to talk about that. One of the things I love about podcasting, and I've been podcasting since 2004, and I created 8 of them. 3 of them are currently ones that I continue to create just because I love them so much. And one of the things I enjoy about having a solo podcast is that I have creative freedom, complete creative freedom. And that's something that I think you should consider. Your voice, your tone, anything that you want to bring to the table doesn't have to be curated in a way to fit the conversation that you're having with the other person, because it's just you. And you get to share your content as you see fit with your audience. Secondly, having a solo podcast allows you to really have that one-on-one connection with your audience. Your listeners are going to feel really engaged because they're hearing from you. And when they hear from you, it makes a huge difference as opposed to listening to an interview, whereas they still might make a connection, but it's just very different when it feels that one person is talking to them. And that's how I like to make my podcast. I really try my hardest to make it so that when I'm recording my show, that I am speaking to the hearts, the minds of my listener, and that I'm speaking to them as a friend. So I go out of my way to make sure that I'm in a mode to talk to someone as though I'm talking to a friend. When I'm recording a podcast, I try not to make it super rigid or overly professional to the point where it sounds like I'm making a speech or I'm trying to get through a Toastmasters event or something. I'm not attempting to perform, really. This is all about making a connection. So I treat it almost like little mini coaching sessions because most of my podcasts are related to what I do in my business. So I try to talk to my audience as though they are one of my clients that is getting a coaching session. And sometimes I talk to them like a friend, like there's someone that I've been knowing for quite some time because they've been listening to my show for a while. And that's the way I like my tone to be. And so you figure out what's best for you. What do you want your tone to be on your show? And if you're creating a solo podcast, thinking about how you present and how you want your listener to connect with you is going to make a huge difference in the way you deliver your content. One of the main reasons I do that is because it allows for my listener to receive that trust factor and to feel more loyal to my brand. So when it's time for them to join my mailing list or come back and listen to another episode, maybe even watch a YouTube video that I've created, anytime that they're moving along the customer journey and there's different touch points, they're more and more willing to engage with me because they've already heard my voice. They've already seen my podcast, listened to my podcast, and they just feel connected. So I think it's a great way to build loyalty and trust with your brand. And my last reason that I think having a solo podcast is so beneficial, especially if you're just getting started with podcasting, is because it allows you flexibility and room to experiment with all these different formats. You might start off with a solo podcast, just you by yourself on a microphone, and realize that you do want to have an occasional guest. So this allows you time to figure out your tone, figure out how you want to present, and realize what you need going forward. You also have time to figure out your tone, your messaging, your delivery, your formats, your styles, and even your topics of discussion without having to coordinate that with other people. So when you're just doing it on your own, it just kind of cuts out a lot of the middleman situation, and you can figure out what you need. Once you figured out what you need, maybe you do want to have an occasional guest, which I highly recommend you try that as well. It's absolutely wonderful having conversations with people on a podcast and having guests. But when you're ready for that, you'll know that this is the kind of topic that you want and the type of format that you want, because you've already been doing your own solo podcasting. And I'll just add one more benefit in there for solo podcasting. Again, after creating multiple podcasts over the past 20 years, at least 8, I will have to say that the solo podcasts have been the most beneficial to me, with an occasional guest. But I think that one of the things that allows me to get my content done more quickly is that I just get my stuff out there. I edit very quickly because I'm not editing the conversation. I'm editing my own audio or video. And it just makes it a lot easier for the editing time. The timelines, also coordinating back and forth between guests is another thing that you have to think about when you do interview a guest, as far as when you're going to both present the podcast, when you're going to share it with your audiences, but all of that in addition to your edits. So for me, that was a big deal. The editing part is a big deal because I do all of my edits. I'm a solopreneur. I have been doing everything in-house, and everything has fallen on me because I just don't want to outsource that part. I do like the creative flow that I have with edits, and I kind of connect to that aspect of my creative process, and I like doing the edits. But the edits are so much easier when it's just editing my own voice as opposed to editing multiple voices on an interview. So I just find that my editing time is cut down tremendously when I'm producing a solo podcast. As far as scheduling goes, it can be a bit of a hiccup to have your guests come on to your show and get them scheduled and get all of the timing and scheduling kind of squared away. It just takes a little bit more of an effort to run a podcast where you do have to depend on your guests or your co-host to show up and do the work with you. So having guests, I do believe, is beneficial, and I'll probably do another video about why it's helpful to have interviews and to conduct interviews and to be on shows where you're interviewed. But when it comes to your productivity and creating content for your business, sometimes it's just a lot quicker and a lot easier just to get that content out for yourself, going solo, getting that information out there, and that way you're not waiting around on anything else or anyone else to be part of the process initially. One podcast that I have really enjoyed over the years has been Pat Flynn, and he hosts the Smart Passive Income podcast. A lot of his episodes have been just him doing solo podcasts all by himself. And I think he does occasional guests now more so than before. But initially, just starting off, if I recall correctly, he did a lot of those podcasts on his own, and he's earned a massive following just connecting to his audience one-on-one through his podcast. Another podcaster that I've been following over the years is Leslie Samuel, and his first podcast that I followed was the Become a Blogger podcast. I believe now it's called the Learning with Leslie podcast or the Leslie Samuel Show, one of those two. But when I first started listening to him way back in maybe 2012, 2013, he had a lot of solo episodes where it was just him on a microphone talking to his audience. And I was one of his audience that loved listening to him every single week. And I didn't care that he didn't interview guests. I was just all about his content and what he had to share because his content was so valuable. And it just really heightened that one-on-one connection people feel, or what I felt when I listened to his show. So essentially, you start to feel like you get to know the person who is creating the podcast because you're just listening to them so often that you feel like you're being coached by them or mentored by them. And that is the key to a solo podcast, especially if you're a coach or if you're in consulting and you really want your customers to be loyal, to be engaged, and to feel that real connection with you, the trust factor is really important. So those are the reasons I love solo podcasting. What are your thoughts on podcasting? I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. I do have a course called Content with Confidence that helps you to sort of jump into content creation. If it's something that you've been holding back on for a little bit and you need a little bit of confidence, this course may be for you. So I'll leave a link to that in the description box. And that's all for now. I'd love to hear from you. Give me a thumbs up on this video and like and subscribe. So I appreciate you, and I can't wait to come back and talk more about content.